10:31. This is Election Studio on Cambridge 105 Radio. And what's the collective noun for Julians? I've got two Julians in front of me.
A wonder.
A wonder of Julians. I have Julian Clover, who's been here all morning and will continue to be here till 1 o'clock, and Julian Huppert, former Liberal Dem MP for Cambridge. Julian, good morning. Have you had much sleep?
Oh, a couple of hours. At least it's not raining, so, it could be worse.
Not a great night for the Lib Dems.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't good in many places across the country, and losing Jo is really brutal. I think she fought a decent principled campaign, was honest and open with people. It didn't get what was needed.
Because you and Rod Cantrell both supported her, didn't you, in the Lib Dem leadership election?
And I think she's a really good person. I mean, she did the really difficult interviews, whereas, Boris ducked and dived and refused to do things without friendly audiences, and Jeremy refused to do any, TV or radio things that weren't friendly enough. Jo actually did them, was open and honest. But was that, that's hard.
Because it seemed the more people saw of her, the more people didn't like her.
I think she did. Clearly she didn't come across as well as I think she should do. I think I still think she's an amazing person. I think. So there's a problem because ducking the difficult interviews makes things a lot easier, and you come across better in friendly things.
It seems to be the way to win an election, it seems.
But I think
shutting yourself in the fridge, way forward.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, and I think there's a deeper issue that those of us who care not just about the tribal results, but actually the future of how our political system works, need to start coming up with better solutions. Because if dodging the debates on climate, hiding in a fridge, refusing to do these things is a good result, then what will happen is people keep doing that. If you can win a huge majority, as we're seeing now, with way less than half the votes, by only appealing to a certain set of people and just ignoring the rest, which is what's happening in the US already,
I wonder,
then it gets worse. We have to try and save that.
Is it political geeks like me, and dare I say you as well, who are the only
I'm proud to be a political geek.
Geeks of Julian, there we are.
Geek and proud of it. Is it only us who care as to whether or not a particular party leader does an interview or not? Because other people, the non-geeks, maybe they don't watch the interviews anyway, and they just vote for the person who they see leading the party they want to govern.
I think that's part of it, but I think there's a lot of other deeper problems. We're seeing a huge increase in the amount of untruths that are told by political parties. And, no party is perfect, no party has ever been perfect. But there's been some interesting independent analyses of straight-out lies that were fact-checked, and huge numbers, Tories in the lead, then Labour, then a big gap. But there's a real problem there. So politicians famously were very careful not to say things which weren't true. You had Michael Howard being pressed, did you threaten to overrule him? No, I did not overrule him.
There's the famous Derek Lewis incident.
And he did not want to lie, and he used very careful words to not say something which wasn't true. There were jokes about that. Whereas now people just lie. And we do see these sort of straight out, that is just not true type comments, and that's a big problem. I'm happy with disagreement. Actually I think politics is best when you have people with different beliefs and ideologies discussing and in a positive way arguing. I think that's great. Outright lies are a problem. We see it in the US where now there's two camps who just neither believes the other. And I really worry that we'll get the same thing going on here.
And I wonder if that extends something I mentioned this morning. I like to think I have a fairly good cross-selection of friends on Facebook from all parties, certainly all the main parties. Yesterday morning when I woke up, all I could see was don't vote Boris, Boris is A, and so on. There were no Jeremy Corbyn is wonderful, vote for him. Yeah. There was nothing Boris is the leader for the future, vote for him. None of that at all. Just all anti-Boris.
Well, but actually the flip side, if you'd had a different set of friends, you'd have just heard anti-Jeremy.
I genuinely think that my selection of friends is a reasonable cross. They're outside of the Cambridge bubble is kind of what I'm saying.
But they're probably not that far outside. And clearly, given the result, it's most people weren't. How do we stop Boris? Because if 80% of the country had wanted to stop Boris, they'd have voted differently. but it's also a really bad message, and that tribal thing of that person is evil is a really toxic aspect of politics. And I don't like it used by anybody on anybody. And I think it leads to the politics of fear. The main messages were vote for this person, not that person, because they're dangerous. And it really was the least... I mean, I said this even not knowing how bad the results were going to be. The least inspiring election I can remember. We had a Conservative manifesto that wasn't properly costed, didn't add up, and that's independently verified. We had a Labour one that didn't add up, wasn't properly costed, and again, that's independently verified. Ours was checked, and actually that made things harder because you can promise more if you don't bother. But nobody cares. I would love to see a system where people are actually held to account for not getting things precisely right, because actually over 5 years you don't know precisely what will happen, but for at least trying to get it about right to start with.
And in the short term, we have organisations like Full Fact who and others who comb through the speeches they pull out, and after the leaders' debate, there they were with the list of things for all of the leaders who took part, at least those ones who showed up for the debates. Should there be somebody in the broadcast just waiting to hit a button which puts up some, flashing icon to indicate that a politician has just said something which is known to be wrong, as opposed to could be disputed or could be being tilted in their favour? And I appreciate the subtle differences in separation.
I would much rather we found a way that didn't involve broadcasters having to do that, because what will then happen is...
I guess broadcasters could take it upon themselves. Nobody asked Sky News to put up a countdown to Brexit, but it appeared there.
But the risk is that it then forces journalists to very quickly make those calls on what's true and what's false.
Right.
And there is that range of things from, this is a lie, we know this to be untrue, and... actually, we're not sure about this, or this could be presented in different ways. So on one of the big sites, the one I mentioned, which said that Tories lied the most, then Labour, and then various others at the bottom, one of the things they said with us was, one of the things they listed as a lie in their categorisation was saying that the reduced state of the economy if we leave means there'll be less money for the NHS. And they said that's not true, because there could be the money for the NHS, it could be taken from other pockets. Now, that strikes me as something which you can argue rather than a lie, but there are other things which are just, black is not white. We should all be able to agree. But I think the problem with all the fact-checking is that I'm not sure people care. So how many people have you come across, and anybody listening here, who said, I was going to vote for this party because I believe in them, but then I fact-checked one of the things they said and it wasn't true, therefore I didn't.
Well, I wonder how many people actually read the manifestos.
Oh.
Or, they rely on the reporting of the manifesto. Yes. I know perhaps one other person. Julian, do you read the manifestos?
Well, fun enough, I did, but my favourite. I admitted that this morning.
I don't think... this has been about personalities,
but again, it hasn't even really been about personalities. I don't think many people voted for Boris because they thought he was a nice personality.
They thought it's get Brexit done.
Yeah, so it was that slogan, and the fact that it's a load of rubbish, that we will not suddenly get Brexit done. It's all click your fingers and it's all solved. Is a tragedy, and it'd be interesting to see how Boris copes with the fact that his slogan in 5 years' time will probably have to be, "We're still going to get Brexit done. We're still there." We'll have done several phases. We'll have done some phases, but it's hard to say how all the ramifications would have been resolved by then.
Sean Lang, who was in that seat before you, said the slogan should have been "Get Brexit Started," which would have been more accurate.
Yeah, it would have been. But I think people are fed up with the discussion about Brexit, and I have a huge amount of sympathy for that. And actually stopping that would have been a much quicker way of ending it. I mean, I have to say, if in the 2016 part of the Remain campaign had been, if you vote to leave, we'll spend the next years talking about this. If you're fed up with talking about this, vote Remain, we'd have won by miles.
This new politics that you talked about, this polemic, this nasty politics, is this post-referendum, or was this brewing before then?
I think it was brewing before then. I think there's always been a certain level of tribalism. People associate with a tribe and dislike others. We've seen that. I think. I've actually, geek hat on gossip paper coming out fairly shortly with Ali Goldsworthy from the Depolarisation Project at Stanford, looking at what's changing and why it might be more irreversible. But social media has made it faster and easier to be tribal and to think everyone else is tribal. And people are much more aggressive when they can't see a person. I know lots of people who are incredibly nasty on Twitter, but if I bump into them around Cambridge, we'll say, hi, how's it going? We'll have a nice chat. I'm sure we all see that sort of dynamic. So I think it's got a lot worse. It certainly changed from 2010 to 2015. I don't want to be party political about it. I saw it in the way that Labour spoke, but I think that's because of who I am and in Cambridge. I think it's probably a more general effect. But that idea that you either agree with us or you are evil is a real problem. I know people from all the main political tradition. I don't think I know anyone in Brexit, but and there are people who are fantastically good. I disagree with Caroline Lucas on a whole bunch of things, and I think she's a fantastic MP and have said so publicly. We need to get to the stage, there are great people, around where you can disagree without thinking somebody is evil for not agreeing.
Do you miss politics then, Julian?
I still think politics is utterly essential. I got involved politically, way back because I cared about refugee issues, about civil liberties, about equality, about a whole bunch of issues, and I still care about those. And I massively care about politics as a way to solve those, as a way to make lives better for people in the UK and around the world. So it's very much a sort of fundamental philosophy of what my purpose is. That's not the same as tribal party politics. So I'm still very much involved with the Lib Dems because they match my political vision, as I have friends elsewhere. I'm doing various other things. I'm a director of a thing called the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, which has been going since 1904, funded by Joseph Rowntree of Fruit Pastels fame. And we fund quite a lot of stuff to try to get democratic and political reform, including trying to find ways to help depolarise. So I'm very keen to try to find ways of talking across the different interests, because the way our political system is going, and I think it's going to get worse for a while, it'll become more like some of what we see in the US, and it becomes incredibly hard then to have sort of constructive, evidence-informed, decent politics, where none of us will get all the things that we most want, but we'll have a much better environment for many more of them to happen. I think, I supported it at the time. In fact, I think it should have been our policy from the start, and actually I think it would have been better if it had been. I think we failed to communicate it to people, and, perfectly fairly enough, other parties tried to misconstrue what it was. I can see why they did that. I think, to say, there's always this question for a party, what do you say if you think it's unlikely that you'll have a massive majority? Do you say this is what we're going to try to do, or do you say if we were to win, this is what we did? So the election could have gone very different. It could have been more like the European elections earlier on. You could imagine scenarios, like clearly far-fetched, where there were 350 Lib Dem MPs. I think it would be bizarre if there'd suddenly been this outpouring of Remain fervour to say, now that you've just voted, we're not quite sure what you meant. So I think we should have been much clearer about the fact that in the far more likely scenario that we weren't in a massive majority, we would continue to support a people's vote, as we had done for many, many years. And the other parties, took advantage of that poor messaging, quite brutally. And actually, as I say, if we'd said straight away, our preference is to not do this, we do not agree with the Conservative and Labour MPs who voted to bring in Article 50, we would still remain. If we'd said write us up, that's our preference, and we'll campaign for a people's vote to get there, unless we happen to have a majority. If we'd said that from the start, then I think people wouldn't have seen it as a switch. But people were able to present it as not supporting the people's vote, which was still the core of what we were saying. So I think it was a sensible policy. I think we should have adopted it a few years earlier, and I think we catastrophically failed to persuade people of what it was.
Was there not research done on this and on how it would play with the electorate?
I don't know the answer. And what we do know is that, polling of what people think parties stand for is always fascinating. There was a YouGov analysis, which, as it happens, was before and after this. And before, quite a lot of people didn't know whether we were a Remain or a Leave party. Yes, I know. The results are astonishing. Lots of people didn't know whether Labour were, and I think there was more reason for that. And lots of people, stayed unsure right to the end, including Labour MPs. But people didn't. There were lots of people who didn't know, and that changed massively. So I can't remember the exact figures offhand, but something like 17% extra people afterwards realised that we will remain. Now, you always find in these polls it's a bit weird. There's a few percent who said that they thought that the Brexit Party were a Remain party, and a few things like that. But
there's always outliers.
There's always a few, like, really. So it helped in that sense. And if the election had been more about Brexit, then I think, like with the European elections, then I think that would have been better. But it became this fight between do you dislike, or do you fear and dislike Boris or Jeremy Moore? And so the answer to that question wasn't Lib Dem stop Brexit. And so we were answering a different question to one I think the electorate were asking. It's quite hard to poll for that because these things can change. One unfortunate thing has also meant that there's issues about how the media balance reflects. They covered Nigel Farage, who's not a candidate, far more than they covered Joe or any of our actual candidates.
Didn't win any seats.
Exactly, but he's still all over the BBC. And there's some interesting questions, about some of that.
Wasn't there a mixed message though with the Lib Dem? Because there was this. Well, we don't think we're going to get a majority. If we do, we'll do this. But we don't think we're going to get a majority. But then right at the beginning, it was Joe Swinson could be our next Prime Minister.
Well, so this is the big challenge because the media like to present a two-party race. And both the Conservatives and Labour very, very much like the idea, and they work with the media, say there's A and there's B, and hence try to shut out all the other parties. This applies to the Greens, it applies, everywhere other than Scotland, because Scotland is rather different. So they're very keen to make it that two-horse race, and as we saw with cutting Joe out of the big debates. They're terrified. I mean, they remember how well Nick did in 2010. They do not want to allow that ever to happen again, and so they work together quite a bit to make sure it can't happen. And we didn't get enough coverage of all the other things. I wonder how many people listening, or even the two of you, as a confessed election geek and something of an election geek,
trainee,
know that the independent analysis from the Resolution Foundation found that the party with the best policies for the people who are in the bottom 10, 20, 30% was the Lib Dems, way better than Labour. I suspect almost nobody knew that. And actually, if you care about dealing with poverty, about dealing with inequality, about making any difference, you should want to be voting for the party that's going to do the most about it, but that never really surfaced.
Just to let you know, Boris Johnson has just left Downing Street in the last few moments to go to Buckingham Palace following his election victory this morning.
Yes.
We're building up the scripts for Series 14 of The Crown.
Yes, and hopefully no more lying, but
What happens now then to the Lib Dems? I mean, you lost, eight seats? And you're leaderless.
So if you compare to 2017, and we can have the discussion about where you should compare it, where we're down one, that may be a reverse. We're still waiting on St Ives in wonderful Scilly Isles style. The storm has meant they haven't yet been able to get to the ballots and count them, so who knows? But it's frustrating because we got 1.2 million votes more. The biggest gainers in percentage, in votes, was us. The Conservatives, went up a little bit, got a huge reward. We went up a huge amount. And lost out, which is definitely frustrating. We got 3 times as many votes as the SNP and less than a quarter the number of seats. There's something absolutely broken. I was just looking at the number of votes per seat, which you'd expect should be about equal. For us, for the SNP, it was like 20,000 votes per seat. For us, it was 380,000. I mean, the Greens are even worse off, and the Greens have 1 seat for the hundreds of thousands of people who vote for them. And I just think we shouldn't allow that to continue. And again, we've been arguing for our entire existence, basically, that we need a better system that is fairer, that means that you don't get a majority of the huge power of that, as we're going to see in spades, I think, based on less than half the votes. That we do see something.
That's not going to happen, Julian, is it? I mean, it's certainly not going to happen in the next 5 years.
So I think the key block there, because actually there are only 2 parties in the UK that don't support change. The Tories have a vested interest in keeping the system such that they get disproportionately good results. And Labour have backed them on this every single time. And that's a huge disappointment. There's lots of people in the Labour movement who have campaigned to try to change Labour's position. The Labour narrative used to be essentially that, yes, we get these big Tory governments, but every now and then there'll be a big Labour government like 45, and that will set up such great stuff that it's worth allowing the Tories to have that sort of control. I don't think that is true. I don't, with the loss of Scotland, and it's astonishing, if you think back 10 years, the idea that there'd be 4 times as many Lib Dem MPs in Scotland as Labour MPs would have seemed utterly unthinkable. It was true red, Labour solidly. Now there's 1. So with the loss of Scotland from Labour, it's incredibly hard to see how you ever get a Labour majority. So Labour has an important decision to make. It's their decision. Obviously, they don't just have to listen to me. Do they want to say that next time there isn't a Conservative majority, they will fix the system? They went into this election, despite lots of pressure from Labour members, from Labour local parties, saying that they would not fix the system even if they got anywhere near it. I really hope that next time they will say that, so that if there isn't a Tory majority, then I think the most likely alternative is a hung parliament of some kind. And that's when all the parties, and this, actually includes Brexit, the Greens, Plaid, the SNP, Lib Dems, everyone else, we could all get together and say, right, we'll have a proper, fair voting system, so that if you get half the votes, you get half the seats, and if you don't, then you don't. Otherwise, we are, I'm afraid, going to keep having these large Conservative majorities or hung parliaments and nothing else.
We've got the news at 11, so just briefly, just before then, Julian, just thinking about Joe Swinson on a personal level. It's hard. It must be hard enough for an MP when they lose their seat. My goodness, you can talk about that, I know. To lose your seat so publicly when you are the leader of the party, not just lose your seat and then lose the leadership of the party. I wonder what the mood is like in Joe Swinson.
It's brutal. And Joe is a really good, decent, principled, nice person. She's had to put up with, death threats, with huge amounts of abuse. And I really feel for her. I'm proud of her. As I say, we didn't get everything right. The message didn't get through, but she is a good person. She will do great things, I hope, for the country. I think she's a huge loss to Parliament.
Interestingly, John Bercow said last night on Sky News she's an excellent parliamentarian.
Yes. No, I shared an office with her for 3 years, and she's a really, really good person. And the amount of hostile stuff she's had to put up with, interesting question about how much of the attacks has been gendered, and there's certainly been a thread of that. It's really, really brutal. I hope she'll be all right. Her husband Duncan also lost his seat in 2015, and so he knows what it's like. And some of the dishonest attacks on him and her. I mean, it was so nasty that it was, there was a court against the SNP. They were not allowed to say some of the things that they had been saying because they were, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was the court decided they were blatantly untrue, and the Royal Mail should not be expected to deliver such stuff which was so untrue. But you still get the whispering campaigns, you get really nasty, dishonest stuff. So no, I really, really feel for her.
And I don't want to reopen old wounds, but when it happened to you, what did you do?
Oh, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, it's, and actually I feel for people from all parties who lose. It's difficult and it's dealt with very badly. So I lost at about 5 a.m. on Friday, so I've been working flat out for 5 years, even more so for the election campaign. And I think on the Friday, I then got an email saying, you must empty your office by Thursday, all files must be deleted. No sense of, would you like to sleep first or have a break? You have to go through a difficult process of writing to people, closing everything off. There's there's one of these bizarre things. You have to go through a redundancy process with your staff, which is kind of difficult, and you have to do the full consultation, which is slightly bizarre because it's, fairly obvious that I'm not sacking you unfairly. I'm sacking you because I literally have lost the job. That. You can try constructive dismissal, but it's, I didn't lose because I wanted to sack you. I lost really upsettingly. And so it's a really
as well as the personal,
and it's so public. And, I had lots of people being nice. Actually, it's quite hard when people are nice sometimes, because you get quite exhausted saying thank you to people, and, you sort of... Actually, one of the best things I did was, because the beer festival was just after the election, and I went to work at the beer festival, and it was great. I mean, it's always great, but it was particularly nice that year because a lot of people wanted to say nice things, and I didn't have to have the long conversation because there were people queuing. You know, and in particular, I was taking the money as people came in, and you could sort of have a very quick, nice thing. You know, well, yes, thank you very much. That's very nice of you. You know, next, which was actually quite much easier for me.
Thank you, Julie. So a beer for
Right,
Jo
sorry.
Swinson. A beer.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I think gin is possibly more her thing, but definitely some whiskies as well.
Bartonshire Gin Festival.
I will check.